Good evening and welcome to the 2017 Literature Matters, a series of lectures made possible thanks to the generosity of Dr. Avie Bennett. My name is Smaro Kamboureli and I'm the Avie Bennett Chair in Canadian Literature at the University of Toronto. I'm really pleased to see you here tonight. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land where we have gathered this evening is part of the territory of the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and more recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the dish with one spoon, one poem covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwa, as well as other allied nations, to peaceably share and care for the resources in the Great Lakes region. I think it's important to remember, actively so, that we are bound in a reciprocal relationship with the First Nations people of this land, a reciprocity that we must honor. Literature Matters is an annual series of talks designed to give Canadian authors the opportunity to reflect on their own writing, to talk about the work of other writers, about the act of writing itself, or the role of literature in society. I should mention before I forget, and I'm prone to forget a lot, that the event is going to be videotaped tonight, and you will have the opportunity, yourselves and others, to see it on YouTube under the Avie Bennett logo. So this is the third double lecture in the series, and it is with great pleasure that I wish to introduce the first speaker. Karen Solie is the highly acclaimed author of 5 poetry collections. Beginning with her first book, Short Haul Engine, published in 2001, her poetry has gained international attention for its unique use of language, its speech rhythms that convey energy, irony, caustic wit, playfulness. She has been celebrated for the audacity with which she chronicles her roamings through the prairie landscape, but also through cultural and social spaces scarred by disaster and failure, or marked by uncanny encounters, inspiring anxiety, sometimes even ecstasy. She takes her reader on the road, from side highways to motel rooms, from farms to reservoirs, from the wildness of nature to the grit of cityscapes, from the intimacy of bedrooms to the public, even the cosmic sphere. So we find Walter Benjamin's Angelus Novus hovering over the barbed wire of a prairie fence. She quibbles with Freud. We see her going to bed with Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher of languages, mathematics, and logic, who published only one slim volume during his lifetime, only to subsequently reject it. Her gaze discloses the toughness and hardships of the labor class, but it lingers with equal passion and attentiveness over the raw fabric of our post-millennial world. A reviewer writing for the London Review of Books called her a poet by whom the language lives, while another reviewer praised the universal appeal of her writing. It's not surprising then that the first volume of selected poetry was published by Blood X Books in the UK in 2013. The Living Option was praised in The Guardian, named a Book of the Year by The Independent, and was a Poetry Book Society recommendation. Her collection, The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out, published simultaneously in the US by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and in Canada by House of Anansi in 2015, was similarly praised by American and Canadian critics alike. Short Haul Engine won the Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize. Modern and Normal, published in 2005, was shortlisted for the Trillium Book Award and longlisted for the Relit Award. Pigeon, published in 2009, won the Griffin Poetry Prize, the Pat Lowther Award, and a Trillium Book Award. Karen was born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and grew up on a farm. She was educated at the University of Lethbridge, where she gained a BA in English, and she pursued graduate studies at the University of Victoria. In fact, I had the privilege of supervising her MA thesis as well as her doctoral studies. She was a dream student, one of a kind. She was that close to completing her dissertation, and it would have been a brilliant thesis on the figure of the monsters in women's writing. But her first book had just been nominated for the Griffin Poetry Prize. And much to my chagrin at the time, she opted to give up the academic profession in order to pursue full-time her vocation, her gift as a poet. Needless to say, I stand before you today as a reader grateful for the choice she made. Karen has served as the judge of many poetry competitions and has been named as a trustee to the Griffin Trust for Excellence in Poetry. She has also served as writer-in-residence at many universities and taught creative writing at many places, including the Banff Centre for the Arts and at the International Institute for Modern Letters in New Zealand, a highly prestigious appointment. In short, she's one of the best poets around, and it's a privilege to have her with us tonight. Please welcome Karen Solie.
Hi, thank you, and thanks, Smaro. Studying with Smaro was wonderful, and some of the things I learned during that time have been formative. Many of the things I learned during that time and that experience. So thank you. In his early 16th century satire in praise of Folly, Erasmus of Rotterdam, writing in the voice of Folly, says of the poets that it is widely agreed they are of my party too, because they are a free kind of people, not restrained or limited to anything, and all their studies aim at nothing more than to tickle the ears of fools with mere trifles and ridiculous fables. And yet they are so bold upon it that you'd scarce believe how they not only assure themselves of immortality and a life like the gods, but promise it to others too. And to this order, before all others, self-love and flattery are more peculiarly appendant. Nor am I worshipped by any sort of men with more plainness or greater constancy. Inquiries regarding the function of poetry are well documented, as are the particular self-doubts of poets, to the point sometimes of appearing as a kind of preemptive strike, as if asserting our self-contempt before others can call us contemptible makes us less contemptible. What is more foolish, Piero Boitani asks, the poet or poetry? I do believe that even the most self-satisfied of artists occasionally suspects they are making a mistake, even wasting their lives, either in the pursuit itself or in their performance of it. The fear of acting out of hubris is a good fear, but there are also, for a lot of us, practical concerns. I admit to having suggested to writing students that they also learn a trade. It's partly tongue-in-cheek, this advice, and also partly not. That one can't make a living writing poetry is an understatement. We all have at least one other job. But making a living aside, people are happy when the plumber, the electrician, the mechanic finally shows up with their expertise. The poet is here, not so much. In a 2012 essay, Mary Ruffel writes that among her fears as a poet can be counted the deep-seated uneasiness that one day it will be revealed that I consecrated my life to an imbecility. Part of what I think I mean by imbecility is something intrinsically unnecessary and superfluous and thereby unintentionally cruel. The subtitle to Ruffel's essay is Our Positive Capability, and I agree that fear is a nutrient crucial to the development of good writing. In addition to the base note fears of loneliness, age, death, the fear one's work may be unnecessary, even ridiculous. Like any nutrient, however, too much can be toxic. An overdose of fear induces paralysis. Fear neutralized by avoiding all possibility for error, though, is a writing without risk, and writing without risk is pointless. Lucrative sometimes, but otherwise pretty pointless. Ruefle's characterization of her fear brought to mind for me the architectural definition of a folly. It's amusing and slightly awkward in reading Wikipedia's list of what characterizes follies to reassign the pronoun to poems. They have no purpose other than as an ornament. Often they appear constructed for a particular purpose, but this appearance is a sham. Equally, if they have a purpose, it may be disguised. They are purpose-built, that is, deliberately built as ornaments. They are often eccentric in design or construction. This is not strictly necessary. However, it is common for these structures to call attention to themselves through unusual details or form. There is often an element of fakery in their construction. The canonical example of this is the sham ruin, which pretends to be the remains of an old building, but which was in fact constructed in that state. They were built or commissioned for pleasure. They are modeled on structures of a previous era. In English, the term folly began as a popular name for any costly structure considered to have shown folly in the builder. Beckford's Folly, an extremely expensive early Gothic revival country house, collapsed under the weight of its own tower. But the connotations of foolishness in idea or practice, of madness or a general lack of good sense, survive alongside older meanings of delight or favorite abode. I like the idea of a poem as simultaneously delight, fakery, a dwelling place, madness, and deliberateness. As is the case with poetry, the term folly is ultimately subjective. A precise definition is not possible. As Ben Lerner writes in his recent book, The Hatred of Poetry, many more people agree they hate poetry than can agree what poetry is. None of us wants to devote our lives to constructing little monuments to our own ability to construct little monuments on a landscape we presume to own. We want to build meeting houses, places of refuge, of experiment, of inquiry, of worship, spaces for protest. We want to challenge and comfort, house and unhouse. Even when striving to simply entertain, we neither want to make knickknacks nor pretentious structures that collapse under the weight of their towers. But if we fear producing that which is merely self-indulgent and superfluous, what do we expect of a poem? Judging poetry by its use value is an error to which both writers and readers are susceptible. One problem is defining what constitutes usefulness. Is solace useful? Anger at injustice? The revelation of terrible truths? Is celebration entertainment? Defining usefulness leads to a determination of what a poem should do in order to satisfy this definition, the conditions its writer is responsible for satisfying. In an interview for PEN America this past spring, Booker Prize winner Marlon James, when asked about the responsibility of the writer, responds, "I'm not sure writers have any responsibility. That's almost like asking, what should the writer do? There's no such thing as should with a writer. If I say a writer has a responsibility to speak truth about the world, are they shirking their responsibility if they don't? If a poet talks about personal space, or cats for that matter, Are they ignoring their duty to the world? I think the writer's responsibility is to get whatever it is in his head down on the page. I don't, however, read James's comments as suggesting the philosophical argument for the beautiful uselessness of art, or art for art's sake. A 19th century proponent of this philosophy was Théophile Gautier, who wrote that nothing is really beautiful unless it is useless. Everything useful is ugly, for it expresses a need, and the needs of man are ignoble and disgusting. Augustine believed that the aesthetics of the male nipple could be praised precisely because it has no function, which is kind of ridiculous, but it's a philosophy still sometimes applied to poetry that is overtly political, poetry of protest and witness. Such poetry is useful, goes the argument, and valued for that. Its function is appreciated, but it is something other than real art, fine art. Meanwhile, another category lies in wait for experimental work judged neither beautiful nor useful, and thus, again, even if something, not real poetry. In this scheme, beauty, usefulness, experiment withdraw to their separate rooms, and the poet must choose. So, how to open concept this situation? James's reflection on the writer's responsibility to get what's in their head down on the page is a place to start. It's complicated inside a writer's head, one hopes, as it is inside everyone's. None of us has access to a pure, uninfluenced, universal imagination because such a realm does not exist. In an essay titled On Whiteness and the Racial Imaginary, Where Writers Go Wrong in Imagining the Lives of Others, Claudia Rankine and Beth Lafferty write, "Our imaginations are creatures as limited as we ourselves are. They are not some special, uninfiltrated realm that transcends the messy realities of our lives and minds. To think of creativity in terms of transcendence is itself specific and partial. A lovely dream, perhaps, but an inhuman one. Our imaginations, what and how we think, evolve within our demographics, our communities, our interactions and experiences, our privileges and challenges. A writer's responsibility to write what's in her head is to write from and through this awareness, which itself evolves over time. Giving full flight to the imagination means keeping active and present in the mind the forces that animate the imagination, forces that include the use of language itself. As the critic Mutlu Konak Blazing observes, writing is no more natural than the things of the world. I've been using folly, mistake, and error somewhat interchangeably thus far, but are they different in category or intensity? Critic Andrew Michael Roberts makes a provisional distinction between mistake, which suggests minor slips and unintended actions, not always with bad consequences, and error, which is undesirable almost by definition and can be as serious as original sin. A typo might turn angel into angle, which we realize is way better, a kind of fortunate mistake invisible to the reader. Or we may get an important detail wrong and be embarrassed. In this sense, no one intends to make a mistake, even when they turn out well. But there are, however, errors of intent. A lapse in our assessment of tone and register might send a poem of anguish right over the edge into humor. Despite our original intention, we might see that as a better poem and follow where it leads. An inability to read past what we intend to say may result in vague gibberish on the page. I'm not quite sure what to make of Robert's original sin simile, but an error in judgment can result in fault ranging from the irritatingly oblivious to the seriously stupid that protestations of intent, either I didn't intend that, you don't understand me, or I totally meant to do that for effect, you just don't understand me, may not ameliorate. Authorial intent is not available to readers. They only have what's on the page. It should be said here, though, that reading is a creative act too, and sometimes we readers get it wrong. As Robert says, mistakes and errors are part of the life of literature and criticism, are essential to creativity. The relationship is fraught, tense with potential in every direction. What can go wrong in a poem is basically everything. One of the things we hope to learn from our mistakes and our errors is to make fewer of them. But alongside the fear of error is the imperative to remain open, vulnerable, to take risks. As is so often the case in poetry, things that seem at odds are simultaneously true. Bewilderment can only be evoked in writing through determined attention to mechanics and technique. A rigorous intellectual engagement with form has no presence without chaos haunting its rooms, without that ambient static of mystery. As readers, we know how a metaphor can render a familiar object utterly strange, but in a way we immediately recognize. This is a poem by Yehuda Amichai, An Old Toolshed. What's this? This is an old toolshed. No, this is a great past love. Anxiety and joy were here together in this darkness, and hope. Perhaps I've been here before. I didn't go near to find out. These are voices calling out of a dream. No, this is a great love. No, this is an old toolshed. The tension that animates a poem, gives it presence, immediacy, life, consequence, depends on keeping radical uncertainty and disciplined judgment alive and active at the same time. So where is folly in all this? I'm tempted to say, with regards to poetry, where isn't it? As Paul Valéry wrote, the folly of mistaking a paradox for discovery, a metaphor for a proof, a torrent of verbiage for a spring of capital truths, and oneself for an oracle is inborn in us. Poetry just gives it an excuse. But here again, the concept is energized by its conflicts. There is folly as foolishness, as a misguided or arrogant intent leading one into error. But also in folly is the notion of enchantment, whimsy, passion, what Hélène Cixous would call our leaps in the night. How can we tell the difference? The uncertainty that inheres in this question is, along with the fear that accompanies it, a positive capability. I teach on occasion and lead workshops, and there are times when writers in those classes wonder why our conversations always seem to end up this way, in uncertainty, mistakes, fear, doubt, and failure, which I'll get to shortly. The answer is, I suppose, that I find these things, as engines of art, deeply compelling. There's even consolation in them for me. I feel it's important to acknowledge here, though, that there is fear and then there's fear. As I speak, there are people who write under threat of exile, imprisonment, death, for whom the safety of their families and communities is uncertain. Aestheticizing fear, romanticizing poverty, runs the risk of fetishizing them neglecting how they are lived, which, among other things, is a failure of the imagination. This might sound like an admonishment, but in fact, an active awareness of where our knowledge is suspect, where it is partial, where it is absent, affirms what we are capable of. Uncertainty isn't weakness, it's curiosity, it's wonder. The fear of producing something pointless or wrong requires putting the work in to not be pointless or wrong. Both encounters involve listening. One effect of a great poem is that you can discern it listening, feel it extending itself from a quiet place. When we say of a poem that it speaks to us, what we really mean is that it seems to respond to something we haven't been able to articulate properly. That's where the feeling of recognition comes from. A colleague of the 8th century Chinese poet Tu Fu said to him that creating an image, or encountering one, I'd say, is like being alive twice. A poet's fear of error, of getting it wrong, of irrelevance, is an energy that refuses to settle, refuses to think the work finished. Proceeding with uncertainty leaves us open to recognize the errors in our thinking, our perception, the limits of language, the limits of our experience and of our abilities. It seeks that recognition so it can edge closer to those limits, to actively encounter them. The truth of art lies in these encounters, not in staggering insights or watertight rhetoric. To be uncertain is to go looking, and to feel oneself looking, to feel the mechanisms of perception, judgment, choice in play. To mistrust, even as we revel in the satisfying click of an idea sliding into place. This is as true for a lyric meditation on your cat's personal space as it is for political poems, as it is for the wildly experimental. As a response to one of the all-time favorite conference questions, what use is poetry? Poet and scholar Mina Alexander wrote a poem called Question Time, which ends. Standing apart, I looked at her and said, "We have poetry so we do not die of history." I had no idea what I meant. You can almost see the door of that last line opening onto an indeterminate landscape that is the continuation of the poem, that is really the poem, where use and uselessness are much more interesting in their osmotic relationship than in any discrete definitions. A Poetics of Uncertainty says, this does not end here. Whether in curiosity, in anger, wonder, sorrow, joy, there is a going on, the poem looking past its last line, listening beyond it. It has to, because the poem will always fail. It's good for a poet to be comfortable with failure. A poem can fail because it's poorly done. It can fail in some respects and succeed in others, both of which happen more often than they don't. But even a poem widely recognized as successful is, as Lerner puts it, a record of failure. Poetry isn't hard, he says. It's impossible. A poem can't achieve what it sets out to achieve, can never realize the revolutionary, devastatingly original emotional genius of the poem in our heads. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, Keats wrote. So it's necessary to take another shot at it. Failure is why art continues to be made. Hardly a new idea, of course. And now here you have very narrowly avoided that Samuel Beckett quote that I don't even have to say. Instead, I'll give you, little slithering sounds as of a rabbit man in full night gear, who lies so low in the rickety willow herb that a fox trots out of the woods and over his back and away. Try again. She tries leaning, pouring pure outwardness out of a gray urn, little lapping sounds, yes, as of dry grass secretly drinking. Try again. Little lapping sounds, yes, as of dry grass secretly drinking. Try again. That's a little snippet from Alice Oswald's poem, Dunt, a poem for a dried-up river. We affirm, we second-guess, we try again. Poetry is about and, not or. It's not like there's limited room in the world, in our minds, one hopes. How many times have we thought, as writers and as readers, that some subjects are played out, dried up, not interesting, that there are some things that just don't work in poems, are mistakes, if not grave errors, and then somebody comes along and totally pulls them off. And, rather than or, isn't equivocation and doesn't avoid hard choices. In fact, it makes more of them. Between failing the easy way and failing the hard way, we should choose the hard way. It's more interesting. There's truth in it, in the effort, in the inevitable failures, in the responsibility to try again. There's beauty in discipline in the face of impossibility. And there's solace in the experiment that doesn't end. Thanks very much.